Today we address the case of Scott Peterson, a man currently on death row for the murder of his wife Lacey and their unborn child. This man has been living in prison for over a decade based on the conclusion of a jury in trial. However, I submit to you that in this case there is not nearly enough conclusive evidence for this man to have been condemned. To be clear, my goal is not to prove the innocence of Scott Lee Peterson. Rather, I intend to show you why I believe this man deserves a fair retrial, where his innocence or guiltiness can be determined more accurately. Now, although there are many clues that point to Scott seemingly being the suspect who murdered his wife, I believe that there are as many, if not more, uncertainties in this case. I pose the question, how many pieces of a puzzle can be missing before you're unable to clearly see what this puzzle actually shows? I believe that there are far too many pieces of the puzzle that is the case of Scott Lee Peterson for a guilty verdict against him to be a just conclusion. An overview of the case at hand is necessary as I begin. Scott and Lacey Peterson were married, living in Central California, and were 8 months pregnant with their first child, who was to be named Connor. On December 23rd or the 24th of the year 2002, Lacey Peterson went missing. Scott reported Lacey missing on Christmas Eve, and a massive search began, where the media became very involved, and this case gained massive public recognition. Scott was not a suspect in the case immediately until information about several affairs and lies that he was involved in came to light. When enough suspicious circumstances arose, Scott became a key suspect and was arrested as such. On April 14th, the body of an infant boy with an umbilical cord washed ashore in the San Francisco Bay, followed the next day by a body missing legs, arms, and a head. This body was later identified as Lacey Peterson. After a lengthy trial on March 16th of 2005, Scott Peterson was found guilty of the murder and sentenced to death. He is now currently being held in San Quentin Prison in California. Now, there are certainly suspicious and unusual behaviors that surround Scott Peterson and lend towards his guiltiness. Some of those I will state now, which include that Scott did have potential motive. The impending baby locking him into a marriage that he no longer wanted to be a part of. Scott may have felt that having Lacey and the baby gone would have been preferable and far easier than a messy divorce right after the birth of their baby. His affairs with multiple women that came to light later also lend to that motive, some of whom he lied to, saying that Lacey was already dead prior to her disappearance. Scott's sister's testimony about his unusual behavior leading up to and after the murder, the suspicious behavior of Scott at the time of his arrest, namely having daggers, knives, and multiple family members' credit cards, 4 different cell phones, as well as large amounts of cash. Evidence that Scott may have researched sites in San Francisco Bay prior to her disappearance. And finally, that Scott had originally claimed to be fishing on his boat in the Berkeley Bay at the time of her disappearance, which later turned out to be quite near to where the bodies appeared. Now, although there is potential motive and granted suspicious behavior surrounding Scott Peterson as the culprit, with further investigation into the evidences that have been provided, I believe that the verdict was reached unjustly for the primary reason that absolutely no conclusive evidence was found that condemns Scott Lee Peterson. He was, in fact, absolutely not proven guilty. All evidences are circumstantial and inconclusive. There is nothing in the investigation that factually, without reasonable doubt, condemns Scott Peterson. Jury members on the case mentioned later that it was due to, I quote, many puzzle pieces pointing to Scott and Scott's seeming insensitivity and lack of emotion, end quote, that caused them to reach a conclusion. This cannot be the sole basis of a guilty verdict in which a man is sentenced to death. There must be some conclusive evidence which leaves little doubt that this man was guilty, and there was none of that. I quote a source who is close to the case. But where is the evidence that he murdered Lacey? Where's the evidence that he put her body in the bay? If 3 exhaustive searches of the house, 3,000 plus wiretaps, hundreds of wiretaps by the girlfriend and various family members, friends being used as spies, cell phone records, examinations of all computers, and an exhaustive search of 1 3/4 square mile of where Lacey would have been if Scott murdered her. If all of these things could not produce any evidence that Scott murdered Lacey, then the only logical conclusion is that he didn't do it. He is factually innocent. End quote. Now, every scenario that has been proposed as to how Scott must have done this has been thoroughly investigated and has resulted in zero proof that, or even serious indications that Scott was responsible for this murder. It seems clear to me that an unbiased perspective can realize that there is not enough conclusive evidence to have condemned this man. Scott was convicted primarily because there was no proof of someone else having done it. Therefore, he must have done it. This is arguing ad ignorantium, which is a logically invalid form of reasoning. As I mentioned prior, the media was very involved in this case, and the media had decided that Scott was guilty. And I believe that the jury was swayed by the opinion of the majority and potentially by the media and the majority of the populace less than by the hard facts. Now, in an honest desire for justice to be served, and I do believe that that was the jury's desire, the jury convicted a man who they had insufficient evidence against. They did this largely because there was no other suspect who could have done it. Now, the fact that it seems like he did it, though it may seem that way, granted, is not sufficient to sentence death. If in all of the investigation, the only reason to condemn this man has been that it seems like he may have done it, that there is no one else who could be held responsible, and that his demeanor didn't fit the emotion and visible sorrow that the jury expected, but there is absolutely no conclusive evidence condemning Scott Peterson, then objectively we must agree that the most just thing is for the case of Scott Lee Peterson to be reopened and for a fair trial to be had before this man is put to death.